what is the problems frequently found in PDF? Is there any update on the survey from, this is a survey from 1993. That's the invention of PDF, so that's a long time ago. There have been a couple of surveys done, and Focus has done some, the Gantuil group has done some. I think the last one that was done was, what, 2018 or something like that. I think what you see over the years is that the problems in PDF don't really differ all that much from survey to survey. The importance of individual problems sometimes changes a little bit. And what you did see at some point is that one of the problems in PDF that came out of the survey was transparency and transparency flattening. And that was a new one, but that's because before that we didn't have transparency in PDF, so it couldn't be a problem. In general, other than that, I think we are still in many cases looking at the exact same issues for the last 20 years.
Yeah, what is the proper way to import Illustrator file to InDesign? And there is another one that is linked to this one. So what is your suggestion? What format should we save in to import Illustrator into InDesign, EPS or PDF? So again, as we said, the easiest is to use the Illustrator file with the PDF layer, and then you import that into InDesign. They usually should work because the PDF compatible file option makes PDF rendition of the Illustrator. If you don't touch that outside of Illustrator, if you don't tweak the file the way I did, in that case, it should normally give a correct result. So we wouldn't advise you to change that, just you're aware of what is happening, and then in case you're facing problems, you know where to search. Would it be better to convert the Illustrator file into something else before importing into InDesign? So here the proposals are EPS or PDF. So EPS definitely not. EPS is a dead format. EPS is based on PostScript. So all of the things that we talked about during the webinar about PostScript comes into the play here. So definitely not making an EPS. PDF could be an option. Again, you could argue that if you take an Illustrator file and you make a PDF and then afterwards you import that PDF into InDesign, that's exactly the same thing than having the PDF compatible layer from the Illustrator. There are some differences though, because first of all, if you make the PDF, you will be able to make you the setting exactly the way you want. Where when you have that PDF compatible layer, you don't know exactly what is done because you don't have any control of how the PDF has been generated. If you do your own PDF, then you know, which means that you can do something that is really good, or if your setting is not good enough, then you can also generate the wrong PDF to some extent. So again, by doing this, you show that the PDF, if you generated the PDF out of Illustrator and you checked that PDF afterwards, and then you import into InDesign, you should have exactly the same result. But that makes the process a little bit more complex. So again, there are, pros and cons of the two methods.
Yeah, if you're wondering how to save exactly from Illustrator or InDesign into a PDF, check out the Gantuil Group website under application settings. There are actually Illustrator and InDesign PDF export settings that you can download and then install. Those will, well, they're a little bit better than what you will get if you just do save as, what is it, high quality print or press from Illustrator or InDesign. Okay, what about converting text to curves within Acrobat? I think we already answered that, but just to make sure, so should you use Acrobat or Pitstop to do the conversion to outlines, and is that going to make a difference? Well, first of all, as long as you don't use the transparency flattener, we will already be a bit happier. But fundamentally, it is not going to be different than, or the quality is not necessarily going to be better. As soon as you convert text to outlines, you are losing hinting and you're getting those differences in the way it's going to look. There is nothing you can do to stop that part, but the result is going to be better than using the transparency flattener. And the second question related to that, we also already answered, I think. Should you then not convert logos to outline in the creative stage? As I explained, the reason we're against text to outline is because A, you should not do this for all documents in a workflow. B, very often it's not necessary. And it's a big problem we have in graphic arts sometimes. We tend to do things because they were necessary 10 years ago. It's not because they were necessary 10 years ago because the RIPs weren't very good that nothing changed since then. So in many cases, the issues that you might have had with a RIP 10 years ago are not the same issues you will have with a more modern RIP. And when we started with the Gantt work group, we had a warning in the pre-flight profile for the use of TrueType fonts. And the reason was that there were newspaper RIPs that had issues in 2002 with the use of TrueType fonts. That's no longer the case, so we don't have that check anymore.
Yeah, there is a very good example of what you're just saying here, which is for the packaging market, where we used to have to outline fonts to do the trapping, because at that time, I mean, many years ago, the software couldn't trap live text. It should be some vector elements. So you had to outline that to do the trapping for packaging. It's not the case anymore. You can do that on a live text. So this is one of the reasons why packaging printers are asking for outlined files, but it's not needed anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so once in a while, I mean, I think Christian and I both have experience with production environments, and we understand that people tend to be a little bit conservative, and for a good reason. But once in a while, you have to also dare to question the workarounds and the practices you have in there, because sometimes the solution for problems that no longer are there are worse than the original problem. And that's the same with this transparency flattening thing. Transparency flattening very often is worse than not doing transparency flattening if you have a decent modern RIP. So we should, I think, as an industry, sometimes be a little bit quicker in evaluating whether a problem is still there, and we still need to do those workarounds that we had to come up with 10 years ago.
I was just on the next one, so I would argue that for VDP, it is better to embed the font. Just to be clear, we never said you shouldn't embed the font. The discussion was about subset embedding and fully embedded fonts. So yes, you have to embed the font. There's absolutely no use case where you shouldn't do.
Yeah. No question whatsoever, and every ISO standard says you have to embed the fonts in the file. There is no option.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think there is an answer to that.
No, there is an answer about the tools that you shouldn't use. Like, don't use anything that is based on Apple Quartz engine, for example.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
One of these.
And be very careful when you're dealing with PDF files that are generated by some website tools, because you have the same problem there often. But you can't always fix that, of course.
Yeah, and normally free tools, I mean, you get what you have for the price you paid.
Exactly. So one correction to a question I see here: according to Rule 1, save as PDF is the wrong method of saving PDF. Well, no, of course not. And I don't see how you could get to a PDF file without saving as PDF. We definitely are not telling you to go through PostScript or EPS. Save as PDF is absolutely the correct method to generate a PDF file of Illustrator. You just have to be aware of what this compatibility notion does, and that is not always the best thing to do. If you're going to save a PDF file out of Illustrator and that PDF is going to production, then don't save this compatibility layer in there. It's not necessary for printing. It will make the file a lot bigger, and as Christian, I think, showed very well with the happy penguin, sad penguin, if the file gets modified by someone along the way in the PDF format, then you risk all kinds of confusion, because there are now two versions of the PDF in the same document. So if you're saving from Illustrator to send to a printer, for example, I would actually switch off that Illustrator compatibility option, because it can only cause problems.
What is the right way to embed full version of font instead of subset? This is actually a setting that you have when you export to PDF, where there is a setting that says subset if the number of glyphs used is below a certain number. And normally, is if you say that it's below 100, then in that case, that means that up until you have all of the glyphs, this will be subset. And if you allow all of the glyphs anyway, it will be full. So in that case, you just have to set it up to 0, which means that in all of the cases, you'd get a fully embedded font. Be aware that sometimes with some fonts, it can happen that even if you ask to get a fully embedded font, you will end up having a subset, and there's nothing we can do against it.
So one other question about the options in Acrobat.
Oh yeah, that's also in the page display. So this is what you have here.
Yes.
Those things with the smooth line art and smooth image and enhancing lines. So these are the things where it's actually going along with what you showed with the thin and fat fill.
Yes.
And by changing those things, you actually can have something that looks nicer, but is less accurate, or more accurate, but looks ugly. So usually those settings are the things that I change from time to time. Sometimes where, especially when you have the transparency flattening, where you can have those thin white lines due to the transparency flattener. We know that sometimes there are things that you see on screen that are artifacts, and sometimes these are real. And by changing those settings, you can actually, by switching on and off, you can see if that scene line is real or just an artifact, basically.
Yeah, they're a little bit less dangerous as well as the use local fonts option, I think, because they're more of an improvement to the rendering, if you want.
Correct. It's display only. It says no impact on the file itself.
Exactly. Yep. The use local fonts should never have been there, in my opinion. But well.
Yeah. For Office, maybe. But, yeah.
That's up to Adobe. Question about PDFs generated by ArtPro and printing workflows. Unless you know anything better, Christian, but I don't think there is anything specifically wrong with PDFs generated by ArtPro, just as there usually is nothing wrong by PDFs generated by most applications. It's mostly a question of how are they created and what are the settings when you export them.
Yeah, the only issue I'm aware of is that ESCO has that file format that they call normalized PDF, which is absolutely not a normalized format, because it's not something that is standard or whatever. It's actually a PDF where ESCO embed a lot of information that is needed for each system. And to put that into their workflow, like automation engine, you need to go to normalized PDF. But I've heard that some software have issues with those PDF files afterwards, that they cannot use them, like some 3D rendering software and things like that, because of that proprietary information that is added to the PDF.
Does the different visual result produced from thin fill versus thick fill, is that only viewing or on screen or also on print? That's a good question, and it's a difficult answer. The correct theoretical answer is the lower the resolution, the worse the effect is going to be. If you think about the difference between the two methods, that should be clear. Of course, our screens get higher and higher resolution these days, so the problem is going to get a little bit less there. In my experience, the problem is usually worse on screen. It is something that you're going to see quicker on screen, but you can definitely also see it on an output device when you print. And it's not just the thin fill versus thick fill. What is usually worse is the lack of hinting in a font, because that can temper with the spacing of characters and so on. And that is usually something that you notice quicker in print. But as I said, you're going to see it more if the either the resolution is lower or the text that you output is smaller. So if you're in large format, the chance, or sign and display, the chance that you're going to see a difference is a lot lower than when you print brochures and all kinds of other stuff with very small text. Is flattening in the original application before saving also not recommended? We kind of avoided this one, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, basically, flattening is always wrong now. It used to be necessary. I mean, since it started, I mean, that's a personal opinion, but we had to deal with this because that was the only way to get to the results. But if we can avoid that, I mean, it's obviously better. And now that we have RIPs that are PDF native, and you don't have to go via CPSI and the PostScript layer, it's obviously much better not to do flattening, because the flattening generates a lot of problems. When you flatten your file, then you're stuck with your color management, because in that case, when the file has been flattened, it's not easy to do color management afterwards, etc. So yeah, I mean, it's not recommended. We're not saying that you shouldn't do it, because sometimes there are no other solution. But if the question is phrased like that, is it not recommended? I would answer yes, it's not recommended.
Yeah, and I think by now this is different than 10 years ago, but by now the official point of view of the Gantt group is also that it is better not to flatten. And this goes back to the specifications that we release as well. We used to have specifications that were compatible with PDFX1A, and in PDFX1A you have to flatten because live transparency is not allowed. We now have specifications that are compatible with PDFX4, where flattening isn't really necessary, because PDFX4 allows live transparency. So you don't have to do it anymore. And it is one of those areas where I think that we were used to do it for so long that now everyone goes like, yeah, we have to flatten anyway. What we don't realize, and I have some experience from from a vendor point of view, because I know lots of the support questions that came in or that come in around PDF Toolbox and the callas software. A high percentage of problem files that we see are actually not necessarily problems with PDF, files per se, but they're problems that happen because someone flattened a PDF. And because flattening can interfere with color conversions, you have to do that in the right order. And so you really have to realize what happens during flattening and the fact that it's a very, very complex process. And the flattening engine you have today in Acrobat, whatever Acrobat version we have today, is much better than what we had 5 years ago. But there are still quite a few problems that are caused by the flattening process and that we never would have seen if the file with live transparency would just be printed on the output device. If you have a printer or an output device where you go like, yeah, but it doesn't handle live transparency correctly, I would advise you to do two things. One is to look at the Ghent Workgroup website and look at the Ghent Output Suite, which is a free set of PDF files that you can download and use to test a printer with and see whether it complies with, it can deal with certain PDF features. And I would also advise you to look at the vendors who say that they are compliant, because they usually have instructions on how to set up the RIP or the DFE in order to output those files with live transparency in a correct fashion. So go to the Ghent Workgroup website, gwg.org, and look for the Ghent Output Suite. Download that. There are instructions with it, and also look at the vendor pages there with the instructions, because that could actually help you in case you have a problem on the DFE side or the printer side.
The last question is for you, I think, David, is about color servers having sometimes trouble with file containing transparency.
Yes, color servers sometimes have trouble, period. So it's a very common problem. The problem is that if you mix color management with transparency, you end up in an area that is dangerous. Let's put it that way. There be dragons. And it's not always that easy to fix. So you have to do color conversion and transparency flattening in the right order, but even if you don't do transparency flattening, starting to modify color spaces in a PDF file is still a very complex thing. And different color server manufacturers have come up with different solutions for that. I think it would lead us too far to really comment on that. On top of that, I'm not an expert in this, so I couldn't give you the whole story on that. If you want to see more on that, we might have some webinar recordings already that go into a little bit more detail on color. But don't hesitate to also write up the topic in the survey you'll get afterwards if you want to see more detail on that. And then I think we need to involve some color experts to talk about that as well. And yes, sometimes it's due to the fact that the color server uses a library to do color conversions, as most of them do, and that there are some limitations or problems in the underlying library technology. That's very possible.
And that's the end of the questions we got. So
okay.
we actually had nearly half an hour of questions.
So yeah, we didn't quite make it
way too long.
Okay, so I suggest we stop here. If you have more questions, if you feel that there is something we didn't cover today, you should get, when you close down the webinar, but also afterwards by email, you should get a survey where you can tell us. You can also just send email to admin@gwg.org, or there is a contact form on the gwg.org website. Just leave us a comment, and we will be more than happy to involve other experts on specific topics, or organize another webinar to tell you some more things you shouldn't do with PDF. because this was quite fun for us as well, I think.